Welcome to William and Lonsdale, a podcast about the legal ecosystem and the fascinating people who make it tick. Today, your host Michael Green speaks with Victorian Supreme Court Justice Michael Croucher, KC. As is often the case with people we speak to on the show, Michael had a unique and surprising pathway to the law. He dropped out of school in Year 10 at the ripe old age of 15 to follow his dream of becoming a professional motocross rider. As well as sport, Michael has a love for music and literature and is known to quote the likes of Neil Young and Archie Roach in his judgments when he feels those writers can better express his thoughts. He has also been called the weeping judge, known to shed a tear in court, particularly when reading victim impact statements, a trait he initially tried to curtail, but later accepted that it was not always something he can control.
I read them in chambers because we get them ahead of time, and they do. And when I read them, I just feel so sad, particularly for the parents of people who've been killed. It brings a tear to my eye at times, and in fact, try to cater to the view that perhaps judges shouldn't be seen to be doing that. I practice reading them without crying, or at least welling up, and sometimes I think I'm going to be okay. But then when it comes to reading my reasons, where I incorporate part of a summary of what's been said by the deceased's family or friends, it just gets a hold of me sometimes.
Our guest this morning in Lives in the Law is the Honourable Justice Michael Croucher of the Supreme Court of Victoria. Good morning, Michael.
Good morning, Michael.
Michael, we'll do the traditional thing and we'll start at the beginning. You've got a really interesting beginning, being brought up one of 4 children in Myrtleford in Victoria's northeast, and you've said it was an idyllic childhood. Can you sketch a picture of it for us?
Yeah, idyllic in lots of ways. It's space is the biggest thing you notice growing up in the country compared with the city, I think. Sports, everyone's sports mad, or most people are sports mad. Hills for motorbike riding, if you're interested in that sort of thing, which I was a lot. Skiing, snow skiing, that's part of our school sports. We used to go snow skiing. Bike riding, push bike riding, footy, cricket, soccer, basketball, anything you can think of. Sport is a really big thing. It's just a more relaxed, open sort of life than living in the city.
Freedom as well? Parents weren't too protective and you could get out and do what you wanted to do?
Yeah, your parents wouldn't see you most of the day. You'd be off wherever, on your push bikes as kids, riding out to the river to swim, or in our case out to our farm to ride motorbikes, or play sport, whatever you wanted to do.
Did you live in the town and have a farm out of town, or did you live on the farm?
Well, both. When I was only a baby, we lived on the farm out of town, but in later years we lived in town and still had a farm out of town, and we had another farm up the valley, up the Buffalo Valley as well.
And your mum and dad still live in Myrtleford?
Yeah, they do. Yeah, Dad's 90 going on 50 and Mum's in her 83 or 4, so they've lived there all their lives.
Tell us a bit about them. Your mum, you say both of them in fact were exceptional people.
I think so. Mum's really bright. She only went to, I think, leaving, they called it in those days, which I think is the equivalent of Year 11 these days. And she went to work in the bank before she was married, but she was an avid reader. She used to love that show, the Tony Barber show, Sale of the Century, and she was a gun at that. She would get every question right all the time. And we'd always encourage her as kids, Mum, you should go on that show because you'd clean up, you'd win the lot, the BMW car and all that sort of thing. One of her friends did, actually, who was a school teacher, and she did go on it and win the lot.
Well,
and we said, well, there you go, you should do it. But she said, oh, no. I'd freeze, I'd be no good. Who knows whether she would have been any good or not, but she used to answer every question.
And what about your dad? He was a man with great abilities.
Yeah.
But self-taught.
All to self-taught. Yeah, he left school younger than that. He went to the tech school in Wangaratta, so was bused down there, and left in the equivalent of Year 9 or 10, and then went to work on the farm. But he's basically a self-taught engineer. He would build machines, and he grew tobacco mostly and ran cattle on the farms. And, yeah, he was very spatially aware person, very good at nutting things out, working out what needed to be done, how it would need to be built, can weld, can, construct things. He went and got a pilot's licence when he was a young fellow and got a commercial licence. On the farm he had an airstrip as well, and he had his own light aeroplanes, and he used to, he did a bit of commercial flying, taking people interstate on trips and that sort of thing, but it was mainly for fun and mates.
But primarily he was a farmer.
He was a farmer.
Yeah.
But he could turn his hand to anything. He did it. Like much later in life, when I went back to school, I think he thought he should do something too, and he went and did a dogman's course, to do with cranes and that sort of thing. And, he topped the class and was very proud of himself about all that. Don't know why he did it, apart from, because he was never going to work in cranes or anything like that, but he just thought he should do that.
We'll get to something later, but maybe taking on those daredevil sort of thing runs in your family, so...
Yeah, well, Dad, he raced motorbikes when he was young, although suffered a few injuries, bad injuries as a result. And with aeroplanes, like he had an aerobatic aeroplane, a chipmunk they're called, fully aerobatic, and he used to take us up as kids and do barrel rolls and that sort of thing in the aeroplane, which was great fun.
What a wonderful childhood to have.
Yeah.
So take us to school, particularly your secondary school. You're good at your schoolwork and you're good at sport, so you're cruising along pretty comfortably at school, but you stop early.
Yeah.
What happened there?
Well, I wanted to race motorbikes, motocross in particular, professionally. That was my dream.
And this was because you'd seen your dad do it?
Well, I didn't actually see him do it because I wasn't around when he was doing it, but I knew he'd done it. But we had a track which he and I built on his farm, a motocross track, and so I learned to ride from a young age. And I started racing when I was at school, when I was 15, or about 15, so in the start of year 10. And, I started to win a few races and do all right, and I could see a bit of a pathway there, and I'd been riding for a few years, and I just fell in love with it, and I wanted to do it professionally. That was the dream. And, of course, as much as my parents, well, my dad at least, was keen that I was doing well, Mum was always frightened that I'd get hurt, as you'd imagine. And, of course, when I said, well, I'm leaving school and I'm going to go and try to do this professionally, they were, I think, troubled at least. And my teachers also.
And how old, just to confirm, how old were you?
15, turning 16. So by the time I left at the end of that year, I would have been 16.
Put yourself in their shoes. If your 15-year-old son came to you and said, I want to leave school to be a professional motorcycle rider, how would you have been?
I would have been aghast, I think. So what do you think you're doing? You're mad. Don't be doing that. But I wouldn't be told. I was very headstrong. I listened. They didn't, berate me about it. They just quietly frowned, I think, whereas my teachers were a bit more, troubled about it, or at least more vocal about it. And I said, what are you doing? I said, this is what I want to do. And so off I went and left school. And I was also working on the farm at the same time. I'd worked from a young age on tobacco farms and liked working. So the idea was that I combined work with trying to become a professional motocross racer, and so that's what I did. So
how did that pan out? You raced all around Australia, I assume?
Yeah. Mostly in Victoria, but, and I went up to a place called Hungry Creek in New South Wales, where it was like an elite sort of training squad thing, for young riders, and taught by a fellow called Stephen Gall, he was the Australian champion at the time, which was all great fun. But and I did well. I was racing and winning races, but I had a couple of bad injuries which slowed me down and put me out for a few months at a time. Perhaps not as much talent as I thought I had, perhaps, being more dedicated to working, and I think falling in love might have changed it all and made me stop doing that.
Well, you better explain falling in love to us.
Well, yeah, Robin, we've known each other most of our lives. We were an item at school when we were 14, and then when I left school we broke up, which was a silly thing for me to do, but there it is, that's what happened. And then when I was about 18 or 19, towards the end of my racing career, we got back together and then got married when we were 22, and we're still together now and have 3 kids, and,
So you've said you've finished out a couple of bad accidents. In fact, you broke both shoulders.
Yeah.
And that was the end of your riding.
Well, yeah, I mean, it was, I could have kept riding, but it's just that it interrupted my sort of development, if you like, having sort of, when I broke my left shoulder when I was 16, I was out for about 3 or 4 months. And then the next year I broke my right shoulder twice, once in the motorbike accident and then once when I was recovering on a push bike, stupidly riding around on a push bike within a week of breaking my shoulder, thinking I'd be okay, and I broke it again. Yeah, and that slowed me down a bit. But it was a combination of injuries and a change in view and perspective and ideas that caused me to give it away.
Did you go back to school?
I did eventually. Well, Rob and I were married when we were 22, and I worked in various things. Like when I finished racing, I worked in the bush as what some would call a lumberjack in logging, chopping down trees, chainsaw, walking up and down hills, driving bulldozers, that sort of thing. And then I actually hurt my knee badly at work, had an ACL injury from a bad fall. And that was another reason that sort of caused me to have a bit of a change of life later on. And we went overseas, Robin and I, after we were married in 88, with an open-ended ticket, wondering what I was going to do. Robin, by the way, she knew what she wanted to do. She was clever and she knew from an early age she wanted to be a kindergarten teacher. She went through school in the usual way and went down to Melbourne to study at the relevant university, and ultimately she became a kindergarten teacher, and she worked as a kindergarten teacher in the northeast. Then we decided to go overseas. We lived in London. She worked in relief teaching and I worked on building sites in London, and we travelled a lot. Well, London was our base. We travelled all over Europe from there. And we didn't know what we were going to do. Robin knew what she wanted to do. She wanted to be a teacher, but I wasn't really sure, and I was.
And Michael, can I ask, clearly you're a bright guy, clearly you're a bright kid. You were topping your grades when you finished high school at 15. Did you feel frustrated, or did you feel, I've got a talent I'm not using? Or was it just a big adventure?
Big adventure. I was just so keen on sport in particular. If I'd had your ability, Michael, I would have been an AFL footballer, but I didn't have that ability. Or, I would have opened the batting for Australia, but I didn't have that ability either. I went all right racing motorbikes, but there were limits to all that. But, I really enjoyed all of the work that I did, whether it be logging, whether it be farming, all of those things. I applied for an apprenticeship when I was 16 at one point and got knocked back. I could easily have been an apprentice, and been an electrician or a plumber or something like that. I probably would have gone into my own business, I'd expect, eventually. And I enjoyed those things. However, later on, the point that you made about, being frustrated probably did come into it a bit later in life. I can remember when we were overseas in 88, sitting on a beach in Italy, having a wow of a time with Robin and with one of her brothers and his partner, and they'd all been to uni, and they were all saying to me, because I was a bit of a loose end then, and I can remember on the beach people saying, my brother-in-law in particular, saying, you should go back to school or to uni, you should do something else. And it was really, that was the sort of spark, if you like, I think, that made me think, maybe I should do that. And so we were away for about, I think, 8 or 9 months. And when we got back towards the end of 88, I then inquired about what I'd need to do to go to uni. What I was interested in at that point, I was interested in economics in particular. Had no thoughts about law at all. And I got some advice from careers people, and they said, well, you need to do year 12 in order to go to uni. There are other ways, but that's the simplest way. So I approached my old school where I'd at Myrtleford High School, or Myrtleford Secondary Colleges, as I think it was called by then. They said I could do year 12. They let me skip year 11, and I did year 12 as a 25-year-old. I was given some advice during that year that I might be suited to law as well, and I should enrol in both economics and law. Anyway, I got the marks to do that, and that's what I did.
Doing year 12 at 25 is unusual, to say the least.
Yes.
I would have thought for most 25-year-olds it'd be a pretty fair knock on their pride to be in a classroom with 17-year-olds. Did you feel like that?
No, I was glad of the opportunity. I wasn't sure what they'd do. I thought they might say, go away, you've had your chance, don't be silly.
You're a married man. Do you have any kids by then?
No, we had kids much later. And look, Robin was very supportive. She worked and basically put me through year 12 and uni, as it turns out. But yeah, it was a bit confronting sitting in class as a 25-year-old with 17 and 18-year-olds, and also seeing mostly the same teachers that I'd seen when I was there when I was 15. But they were all really helpful and supportive and made it much easier. And it is much easier to study, I reckon, when you're that age. Or at least it would. If I'd done year 12 when I were 17 or 18, I think, my head would have been focused on motorbikes and other things. I don't think I would have done very well, but going back at 25 with a purpose, it made it much easier, I think.
So, Michael, you have a good year 12, you get good marks, you get into economics law at Monash, and you said your main interest was economics, and you got a cadetship or a scholarship with the Reserve Bank.
I did, yeah.
Is that something you had to apply for, or?
Yeah, I was encouraged to apply by economics lecturers because I'd done well in economics and I was interested in it. And one of the options available was to apply for this, they called it cadetship, I think, but it was basically a scholarship where the Reserve Bank would fund you to do an honours year in economics and then guarantee you a job basically with the Reserve Bank afterwards. So I remember, I got this scholarship and I went up to the Reserve Bank in Sydney to have a look around. They flew me up there and I don't know, I just sort of got the impression that it wasn't really for me, although I'm still interested in economics and have been all my life. But at about the same time at uni, I was doing more and more law subjects because you do about 50-50 law and economics when you had a combined degree. And it's still the same now. And I did criminal law and evidence and torts and things like that. And I don't know, those things just sort of sparked a bit of an interest in me and more interest than economics. And I started to, so I didn't take up the scholarship or the cadetship and I focused more on law and in particular criminal law.
Did you have a job while you were at uni to help support you and Robin?
Oh, bits and pieces, but and we were also building a house at that time, so I did a bit of, some minor stuff on the house. I remember building bits and pieces around the back. But no, really, Robin put me through uni, yeah.
And did you go through in the standard time or could you accelerate it a bit?
You couldn't accelerate in those days. You can now. I know through my own kids who are at uni now, but no, you couldn't. In fact, it took me 6 years rather than 5. I got crook 1 year and that sort of held me back. I was away for about 6 months. But yeah, I finished in 6 years and then got articles.
What about your articles? Where did you do those?
A place called Hale and Wakeling. That's Andrew Hale and Sue Wakeling. Sue's now magistrate. Yeah, they were a criminal law, family law firm. And in fact, I was supposed to be articled to a firm called Grace Warren Hale, and the Hale was Andrew Hale, and the Warren was Leanne Warren of Leanne Warren and Associates, and the Grace is David Grace, David Grace QC. And I had my interviews with David, in fact, and Leanne, I think, and Andrew, in the year before you get the articles, in your last year of uni. So I had the job with them, but then over the Christmas, that was when David, who, as you know, is a solicitor, but a solicitor advocate who remarkably took silk as a solicitor advocate, one of the few who did, and then he went out by himself in the following year. So the firm split 3 ways. David went off by himself, Leanne set up her own firm, Leanne Warren and Associates, and Andrew and Sue Wakeling set up their firm as Hale and Wakeling, and I went with them and did my articles with them.
What were your articles like? Were you given responsibility? Could you actually do your own matters? Or was it very...
That was, that's a lot of criminal law firms are like that. They give a lot of responsibility at a fairly early stage, and I was very keen on advocacy in particular, and so I was given a lot of responsibility to do matters, do my own advocacy to the extent that I could. In articles, of course, you can't much unless you get leave from the court to appear, and I did a couple of times in minor matters. But then after articles, and my first year as solicitor, I was allowed to do appearances, and which I did in criminal matters mostly, a few family law matters, but mostly criminal matters.
And then at some stage you did work with David Grace QC?
Yeah, I was, in fact, after doing my first year as solicitor with Hale and Wakeling, I was going to go to the bar, but then, as it turned out, one of David's employees was going off on maternity leave and he needed someone. And so he asked me if I'd work for him, which was the plan in the first place. And yeah, so I jumped at that opportunity because he was doing the sort of work that I was very interested in, which was crime, but appellate crime in particular, Court of Appeal and High Court, and that sort of thing. And so I jumped at that opportunity and worked with him for 12 months before I went to the bar.
It intrigues me that you enjoyed appellate work in particular, because most young barristers or young lawyers coming through in crime love to do trials.
That's true. Yeah, I'm not sure why it was, but it's just one of those things that at uni I got intrigued, about the intricacies of where trials might go wrong, and that, of course, leads to appeals. And so I pursued that interest. I mean, I did trials when I went to the bar. Ultimately, I did trials as well, but my major focus was on appellate work to the extent that I could get it. Of course, you don't hit the ground running with that necessarily, although I got a lot of that sort of work early, which helped me.
So you had about 3 years, I think, as articles and being a solicitor.
That's true. Yep.
Then you come to the bar, reading with Simon Gillespie Jones.
Yep.
Were you like a duck to water when you came to the bar?
I think so, in some ways, yeah. I as you say, I mean, most young criminal barristers want to do trials, and I did do that, and all sorts of other things like, pleas and bail apps and contests in the magistrates' court and that sort of thing. And in fact, I did my first trial with Simon. We were for co-accused. I put myself out there as being interested in appellate work and got a lot of junior briefs doing that sort of thing, and one thing leads to another. And I did a lot of junior briefs with Phil Priest, who's now in the Court of Appeal, Paul Holdenson, Pat Tian, who were both all doing appellate crime, a lot of it. So that helped me along the way, that I had those sort of people to work with and learn from.
And also Robert Richter. Robert played a role in your...
Yeah. After a few years at the bar, where I was just in chambers, in Isaac Chambers with a mate of mine, Ashley Halfin, Robert contacted me and said he was setting up these Crocker chambers, and he'd already set them up with Terry Forrest and Con Heliotis and Phil Dunn and Remy Vanderweel, but they were moving to the Wheat Board and trying to get a bigger set of chambers because they'd all taken silk by then. The idea, originally Robert was the silk and the rest of them were juniors, but by the time they all took silk, they regarded themselves as top heavy, which is right, and they wanted to introduce juniors into their chambers, so I was one of those they invited, and I did a lot of cases with Robert as well, which was, of course, a great experience.
Can you tell us about some of those cases you done? Are you able to talk about them? A Michael Neal case?
Yeah, Neal was... that's one of the appeals that I did, which, I regard as significant. It's very confronting sort of case, sexual case, but it's just one of those that trial counsel had set the point up beautifully. It was about issues to do with the sort of consent or otherwise that might be relevant to an offence involving endangerment based on the transfer of aids, effectively. So that one was pretty important to me. I mean, they're all important, of course. But probably Momcilovic was one of the bigger cases that I did. That was in the High Court. It's my Penge Bungalow murders, if you're a Rumpole fan, probably, because that involved a solicitor who was charged with drug trafficking based on drugs found in her fridge. She was married to her partner, I should say, was a drug user and trafficker himself. She wasn't. Anyway, so she was charged based on possession or alleged possession. Anyway, it went all the way to the High Court, and it involved issues about the Charter of Human Rights in Victoria, constitutional issues, basic criminal law issues, and a cast of thousands were involved. Attorneys general across the country all intervened. There were, I think it was something like 30 barristers at the bar tables. It went for about 4 days, I think.
And you were lead counsel for the appellant?
Yes.
Momcilovic?
Yes. And interesting.
You weren't silk at the time?
No, I wasn't, no. And I had two juniors, one of whom was Chris Walker, who's now, she's since been Solicitor General and is now on the Court of Appeal, and Catherine Boston, who was one of my readers. Yeah, and we had a win, which we're pretty proud of, although we didn't win every point. We won the point that mattered. A conviction was set aside.
And when you say what was the point that mattered, there was an issue about reverse onus of proof?
Yeah, it's still a provision in the Drugs, Poisons and Controlled Substances Act, which basically says that if you're in occupation of premises, if that's proved beyond reasonable doubt, and obviously if you live there, you're in occupation, generally speaking, and if drugs are found on those premises, then the onus is on you, the accused, to prove that you weren't in possession on a charge of possession. The twist, though, is that trafficking, as opposed to possession, can be based on not just actually selling, which is the common way, but possession for the purposes of sale. And there was this bit of confusion in the law, at least in the minds of some, about whether or not this Section 5 of the Drugs Act, meant that a person charged with trafficking based on possession for sale had to prove that they were not in possession in order to be acquitted of trafficking based on possession for sale. My view, and I think it was supported by some earlier cases, said, no, that's not right. You need to be, because you have to be in possession for the purposes of sale, the Crown has to prove beyond reasonable doubt that you knew you had it, rather than you having to prove that you didn't know that you had it. Anyway, The court ultimately agreed with that submission, although with some help from the court. I remember Justice Gamow and Justice Kiefel, before she was Chief Justice, both were onto a particular point that helped me a lot. And I'd like to claim it, but it was their thinking that helped me win the case.
William and Lonsdale is brought to you by Green's List, one of the leading multidisciplinary barristers lists in Australia. Green's List believe in promoting conversation around the ideas and issues that shape not only our legal system, but our wider community.
Michael, you were a relatively young silk in terms of years of experience who loved the bar, the camaraderie at the bar, which everyone loves. You have a competitive streak, which the bar seemed to feed, and yet you accepted the Attorney General's offer to join the Supreme Court. Why did you do that?
Oh, it's a combination of reasons, probably. I should say, as you say, I love the bar, and I know Phil Dunn always says that God loves barristers, and he's right, I think. It's a great life. But and I don't want to sound too high-minded about it, but it's a great privilege to be offered a job as a judge in the Supreme Court. So I thought about that sort of sense of duty, but more selfishly, I also thought my kids, 3 boys, were at an age where, they were late primary, early secondary school or heading that way. I was working 1 million hours a week as a barrister. I wasn't very good at saying no as a barrister, so that, I was always working.
Can I say there, to my observation, every barrister is insecure. Yes. And every barrister can't say no.
Oh, well, I'm glad to hear it. Yes, being a barrister is permanently being insecure at some level. In some ways we're glorified, I was, a glorified peace worker. You're just waiting for the next brief and you do it, and who knows, you might be forgotten about in a week's time. But it was a lifestyle choice in part, as well as I said, the duty and honour and the interest in being a judge. I'd never coveted the idea at all of being a judge. Law was a bit of an accident for me, as I've tried to explain, and being a judge similarly. But I thought that I'd be able to have a bit more of a role in my kids' lives growing up than I would as a barrister, and which has proved to be true because they're all mad on sport, and I was able to drive 1 million miles driving kids to and from sport, as well as working hard as a judge. A bit more balance, a bit more, because you can plan your life a bit more as a judge than as a barrister. No sort of last-minute briefs where you get a brief on a Friday where you have to work up for the Monday. Well, you just got to work 25 hours on the weekend to get it done. That tended not to happen, or hasn't so far anyway, as a judge, although I still, as a judge, misjudge how long it takes me to do certain things and find myself doing long hours sometimes. But as a barrister, I would do all-nighters at times, literally all night. I would be up, not sleep, to get things done.
Just to go back then to you being a barrister, in doing all night, literally from through until 6 or 7 the following morning, can you maintain the quality of work with the tiredness?
You can when you're younger, and, well, I could anyway, I think, but then you collapse after that. Collapse is a strong word, but when I did those sort of things, I would have to have a day or two off to recover, and I suspect I'd struggle to do it now at 59. But then, of course, if I had my time again, I think I'd be much more sensible about how I organised my time and probably learn to say no a bit more and make better judgments about those things. But, it's easy in hindsight.
Exactly. Did you quickly fit into being a judge? Was it something which you naturally took to, or was there an adjustment period?
I'm still adjusting, Michael, and it's now nearly 10 years. Once a barrister, always a barrister, I think, and I miss being a barrister every day of my life, as much as I love doing what I'm doing as a judge. You've got to resist the temptation to stick your nose in. You've gone from being, in footy terms, a player to an umpire. So you've got to adjust in that respect. Of course, you don't win or lose. You mentioned the competitive streak before. I didn't realise how competitive I was, perhaps until I became a barrister, and then realised even more when I became a judge how, I missed that competitive drive. And that's even when it comes to losing, while you want to win everything, of course, pride says you do, even losing is part of the balance that comes with being a barrister. It makes the highs higher, I suppose. But as a judge, of course, you don't win or lose anything. You just try to do it without fear or favour or affection or ill will. That's the oath or affirmation we take, and you just do your best to do justice in the case.
But I was asking, is there an adjustment period?
Yeah, well, people talk about the hump. Some people will say it's 6 months, 12 months, 18 months. There's silly little things like, and most judges have had this experience who've come from the bar, is when the tipstaff or the associate says all stand, the first few times you find yourself standing, when you've got to wait for the others to stand. Just little things like that. I think learning to listen rather than talk is important. Some people get that quicker than others. They're the main things, I think. But it's also about consulting. Whilst it's at one level it's your decision and your decision only, the nature of things is that judges talk to each other about difficult things, and you weigh things up. In sentencing, which is one of the hardest things, you often run it past colleagues because your first thought might be wildly out of kilter, either way too high or way too low, and you see what others think, and that can sometimes save you from making a poor decision.
Michael, you mentioned sentencing. Please correct me if I get this wrong, because I'm not a criminal lawyer. But for sentencing, I think there are guidelines set out by legislation.
Yes, and common law.
And the common law. That being the case, with those guidelines, do victim impact statements have an effect upon your sentencing, or are they mainly to help the victims express their sorrow, their loss?
Yes, it's difficult. I think one view is the latter view, that it's about giving victims a voice so that they express their sorrow, loss, as you say. The other is, consistent with that view is, and I remember it being said when victim impact statements first came in by very senior and experienced people like Frank Vincent and others who'd done crime for years as judges and barristers, that really all victim impact statements do, and this is not a quote from Frank, by the way, this is the gist of it as I understood it, is tell us what we already would have assumed anyway. A person loses a child, it's the worst thing that can happen to a parent. We know that it must be horrible, and that's something that's always been taken into account in sentencing anyway. The other view, though, is that it's not only an emotional release, if you like, or for the victims, but it does inform, and informs in a powerful way. And does it change the sentence? I'm not sure, but they certainly have an effect on me, I can say, because when I read victim impact statements, they're always, in one way or another, powerful, eloquent. They vary in, some people vent and just, want vengeance, if you like. Others are much more reflective and focus on the positive things about their dead son or daughter. Others are in between and just talk about the horror that crime has had on them, and effect it's had on them. And of course, in my job in the Supreme Court, it's mostly about death, because we deal with homicides, of course, routinely, or we're the only ones who do, although the county court deal with car accident victims, of course, and death is death. It's the same effect on the families of those who are left behind. I, for what it's worth, I find victim impact statements very powerful.
And they have more than once, I think, brought you to tears.
Yes, the weeping judge.
The weeping judge. I have heard that phrase used, Michael, yes. You could look at that two ways, I assume. One, well, is this appropriate for a sentencing judge to be so emotionally affected? Or two, it's good that we see the human side of what can be a very forbidding system, the criminal justice system, and therefore it's good to see human emotion shown.
Yeah. I've had both reactions from people, both colleagues and those who are not colleagues. I can remember one non-lawyer sending me an email saying how good it was. He thought that, he's supportive of me. He could see that I was distressed about it all, but was also saying he thought it was a good thing, don't think otherwise. Whereas others who probably won't come out and say it to you directly think, well, a judge doesn't do that. A bloke doesn't do that, that sort of thing. I should get one thing straight. I'm a bit of a sook. So although I wasn't always, I reckon I was a hard kid as a kid. I don't know, something changed in me at some stage in life.
Having your own children could do that.
I think it's a big part of it. Films make me cry, songs make me cry, poems make me cry. But more seriously, coming back to this situation, victim impact statements, I read them in chambers because we get them ahead of time, and they do. And when I read them, I just feel so sad, particularly for the parents of people who've been killed. It brings a tear to my eye at times, and in fact try to cater to the view that perhaps judges shouldn't be seen to be doing that. I practice reading them without crying, or at least welling up. And sometimes I think I'm going to be okay. But then when it comes to reading my reasons, where I incorporate part of a summary of what's been said by the deceased's family or friends, it just gets a hold of me sometimes. And and I worry about it because despite those 2 points that made before, which go either way, there's also the concern that, well, if you break down in one case but not another, what does that say? Well, of course, every case is treated equally, but I don't know, sometimes particular circumstances just get a hold of you, and they certainly do of me, and out it comes.
Michael, I'd be of the school that says that it is of benefit that the human face of the law be seen by people that are in the system. So I'm on your side.
Good. Thanks.
It doesn't matter in the slightest, but
yes, it does.
I am on your side. And you've also, your love of literature and music comes out in your judgments as well, which is not a common thing. I don't remember as a student ever reading a judgment that mentioned music or literature.
No. Yeah, that sort of came about for a few reasons, but one of the main things was, as judges, and this is more common than it used to be, we do various courses, like judgment writing courses, for example. And I remember when I did a judgment writing course fairly early on in my time as a judge, I had the benefit of the author, great cricket writer, Gideon Haigh, come along and talk to us about how we should write judgments. And, he had a look at a few of my judgments and said, okay, there's something there, but, you've really got this is extraordinarily powerful information. You should perhaps concentrate on writing at least a paragraph or two in a judgment that makes it more interesting. He said, you'll feel better about it. The public will understand it more if you write in that way. You should think about it. And of course, he understood in saying that the nature of what we do, particularly in the serious criminal cases like murders and manslaughters, you must be careful about how you do this sort of thing because of the obvious issues that are at play. But recognising that there is a balance to be struck. And anyway, so with that in mind, and because I think you can see in most cases there's usually a song that's been written or a poem that's been written that touches on the same sort of issues. I think that those who write those songs and poetry and other pieces of literature, they're much better at it than I am at conveying in a few words what would take me many more words to convey and probably not nearly as well. It's just a way of communicating. It's a way of getting across a simple idea about loss or joy or domestic violence and the impact it has or whatever the issue might be. And so every now and then I try to incorporate something like that, and a few of them have been more famous than others, probably in the eyes of some.
Can you do it if you're writing an appellate judgment? I mean, appeals are about points of law, therefore, or have they got to be just dry law?
Well, some would say they have to be, but I don't think so. I think they can fit anywhere, provided it's managed properly and carefully. And, you don't go cracking gags in judgments or putting in things that might be misconstrued as inappropriate, or at least you hope you don't. Well, I hope I don't. Whether it's in appeals or... It fits more readily into sentencing probably, but it can fit... I've done civil judgments where I've incorporated things like that because I think they fit. As I say, I'm really just borrowing from others who are better at it. They're better writers than I am, better than I'll ever be, and it's more likely, I think, to be understood by a wider audience by using that turn of phrase or lyrics from a song or something like that.
Lives in the Law is proudly sponsored by City Maps Illustrated. Their recent publication, The Melbourne Map, is a celebration of our wonderful city. This stunning, hand-drawn illustration, which took more than 3 years to create, is available as an art print, jigsaw puzzle and calendar. The perfect acquisition for your home, office or corporate gifting.
Michael, to close, I'd like you to reflect a little bit on your life. No doubt you have plenty of times, and maybe give some advice to people coming along. Because you didn't follow the traditional path of go to a good school, get high marks, go to law school, get a job in the law. You came to the law in a roundabout fashion when you were an adult and have had a stellar career. What would you say to somebody like you who's in their teens, in their 20s, not sure what they want to do, maybe floundering a bit? What would you say to them?
Well, lots of things. Not sure if any of them would be of any help, but I'd say follow your passion. I'd say it's never too late to try something new. It's never too late to study law. In some ways, law is easier with a bit more age and experience because it's you've got a bit more of a real-world understanding, and I think it helps you understand legal problems more. But some people, of course, are brilliant and they can do it at 18 and go through the traditional way. And, I would advise kids to do that if they could. Don't do it the way I've done it, but you can. It's never too late. But whatever you choose to do, take it seriously, work hard at it, and it's amazing what you can achieve with a bit of luck. I've had a lot of luck, by the way, at every turn, so I don't deny that.
There's an old saying about the harder people work, the luckier they get.
Well, I agree with that. I think it's right. I still was very lucky, though, in lots of ways. I was lucky to be born into the family that I was born into. I was lucky to have loving and good parents, generous people, good teachers, other good people around me who gave me a go at every turn. But as you say, hard work makes good luck, and people recognise hard work, and rightly so. The one thing I would say to people is put your head down and have a crack.
Michael, thank you very much. Justice Michael Crouch of the Supreme Court of Victoria has been our guest this morning with the most interesting story about a life in the law, and a different story, and an encouraging and inspiring story, I think, Michael. Thank you very much for coming.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Show notes from today's episode can be found at greenslist.com.au/podcast. There you'll find links to things we've talked about in this episode, a transcript of the show, and some wonderful photos of our guests. If you're enjoying Lives in the Law, please tell your networks, subscribe, rate and review the show. Your host is former lawyer and Greens List clerk Michael Green. Our show is produced and edited by me, Catherine Green, mixed and mastered by Windmill Audio, and recorded by Alex McFarlane, who also wrote and performed all the music for the series. We're coming to you from the iconic Owen Dixon Chambers on the corner of William and Lonsdale Streets in our beautiful city of Melbourne. We acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation as the traditional custodians of this land and pay our respect to their elders past and present. There is no doubt that conversations about justice have been taking place on this land for thousands of years, and we are privileged to continue that discussion here today.